Hello, and welcome to the Esri GeoDev webinar series. This webinar is a continuation of the series we created in the hopes of engaging in developer-related topics and discussions in between Dev Summits. We hope you get as much or more out of it than you anticipated. Now we would like to introduce you to today's webinar, Building a Widget Using the ArcGIS API for JavaScript. I would now like to introduce Matt Driscoll, software engineer with Esri, and JC Franco, software engineer with Esri. Matt, let's get started, shall we?
Thanks, Amy. Hello, everyone. Welcome to Building a Widget Using the 4x JavaScript API. My name is Matt Driscoll, and I'm here presenting with my colleague, JC Franco. Both JC and I are software engineers on the JavaScript API team, and we focus on building widgets for the JavaScript API. We also work on the framework for being able to build widgets with the API. So on the agenda for this webinar, we're going to go over what widgets are. We're going to talk about why we use them and how we can get started with them. We're going to go through our widget framework and show up all the cool parts and things that you guys can use and what it offers. We're going to briefly touch on styling our widgets, and then we're actually going to build a widget together. So let's talk about widgets first. What are widgets? Well, basically they're encapsulated or packaged up user interface components. They are cohesive. That means they're well integrated or grouped together. They usually have a single purpose of functionality. So that means basically they're designed for a specific task or function. Why do we have widgets? Well, we have them because it lets us reuse them throughout our application or even different applications. We can easily swap them out so they're interchangeable. So if we want to replace a widget, we can easily do that. And so how do we do that? Well, we use our widget framework, Esri Widgets widget, or you could just use the view model of a widget and use whatever framework you want. So now I'm going to turn it over to JC Franco, and he's going to talk about our widget framework.
Thanks, Matt. If you haven't heard the first version of the JavaScript API, our widget framework, all of our widgets have been now split into the UI and the core of the widget itself. And what this means in terms of architecture is that we've separated these into separate modules, and we refer to these as the views and the view models. So one of the reasons we did this is because it allows us to separate our concerns, and this makes it easier to identify and target different tasks. So if we have a new feature or bug that we know is specifically UI driven, it makes it easier to find since it would belong in the view, and if it's something with a core way the widget works, we would find it in the view model. The other reason we went with this approach is because it allows our widgets to be reusable, and what this means, for example, is if you have your own UI library or way of building UI, you can just take the view model and implement your own custom UI on top of it. And along these same lines, it's easier to integrate in different application frameworks because you now have the core of the widget that does not have any UI concerns with it, and you can bring it into your application and just worry about the UI yourself and if you need to. Another thing to note is that we build our widgets with TypeScript, and we won't really go into much detail in TypeScript, but we will provide some links at the end for you to check out and see what it's about. But as its name implies, it allows us to write type-safe JavaScript, and this is basically allowing you to write safer code. So as you define your classes and interfaces, TypeScript will let you know if some properties are not matching, or basically allows you to catch errors earlier in the development cycle. And another neat feature is that it allows us to use future JavaScript today. So if you've seen or are familiar with ES6, it has a lot of features that allow developers to write more concise and expressive code. So that's kind of one of the reasons that we really like TypeScript. And it's also widely supported by more and more IDEs, and if you have one of choice. So I mentioned views before, and what this means is, in terms of widget development, is they will be extending our base widget class, which is found under this module path. The key idea is that they will rely on the ViewModel APIs, so any sort of value object that the view needs to render parts of it, it would be driven by the ViewModel, ideally. And anything that is UI or user experience focused will belong in the view. Now, for view models, in terms of implementation, we will be extending Esri Core Accessor, and this is one of the main classes in the JavaScript API, and it allows us to kind of share some of the patterns that we'll see across in some of our code. And if you looked at our SDK and samples, you notice that we have a consistent way of creating classes and assigning properties. So we get all that because we're extending this base class. And as mentioned before, its goal is to have those APIs for the view to invoke, and then behind the scenes, if you have, for example, an asynchronous request, the view model will take care of it and then just provide the view with the APIs or value objects it needs. Anything business logic wise will be found in the view models. Like I said, if you have any asynchronous requests or data processing, it'd be found in the view model itself. So kind of a overview of how these two components work when the widget is rendering is initially when you create your widget, the view will render its state. And what this means is either by a combination of the widget's properties or internal state, or including the view model's properties, it would have what it needs to render its UI, and we'll see an example of that later on. And then at some point in the widget's life cycle, if for example you click on a button, that button, it is very common for that when you click on it, it'll invoke or call an API from the view model, and that will lead to a change either by a property exposed in the view model or some result that the API will return. Once that's done, the view will get notified and then update itself. So this is, you could think of it as a snapshot that would end up being repeated multiple times during your widget's lifespan. So this is our base widget class, and it gives us a life cycle. And we'll cover that in the next slide. And it allows us to gives us different hooks that we can leverage to kind of better structure our code. And since we're extending the accessor base class itself, it allows us to keep the API consistent. So as I mentioned before in the SDK and samples, you've probably seen the unified object constructor pattern where when you initialize a class, you pass a plain object, and the properties of the class will be set to the values of this object. It also is driven by properties, and you can configure properties as needed. We'll see that an example of that later on, as well as in our demo. And related to properties, you can also watch for properties, and so that you can react to any changes that whenever properties are modified. So for the lifecycle, when you create your widget, the constructor will be the first thing that is invoked. And this is a good place if you have any sort of binding for functions that you might want to set up, or if you have some logic that needs to run very early, the constructor would be a good place to set it up. Then comes a post initialize, and this is the point in time where all the widget's properties are fully initialized and are valid. And this is typically the place where we set up all our event handlers and all the wiring up for the widget. Then render comes into play, and it may be called once or more than one time during your widget's lifespan. And I have a slide The next slide will cover it more in detail, but it's where you define your UI, and we'll see what that means in an example. And lastly comes destroy, and this is basically a good point where you want to free up all the resources that your widget is consuming. So if you are done with your widget and need to free up its resources for garbage collection, you would just set up any teardown logic in this hook, and then whenever the widget's destroy method gets called, it'll clean up. So render is a very key concept in our widgets, and this is where you will be defining your UI. So based on your widget's properties or internal state, you would return a representation of the node that you would want to be rendered in the browser. And this is driven by the state. So whenever render gets invoked, the idea is that whatever the current state is at that time, you will define your UI. And we'll see an example of what that means. And the way we write our UI is by using JSX. And this is just a syntax that means that allows us to write very closely to markup. And it's really nice to see because it's easy to read and it looks very close to what you would expect to see in the DOM. And it even though it looks different from JavaScript, it gets compiled down to JavaScript. So it's just more of a syntax that we use for convenience. And lastly, all of our widgets are driven by a virtual DOM system. So what I mean by defining your UI is the return value of render is actually a virtual node. And some other part of the virtual DOM system will take that node and then determine whether it really changed something from the previous render, and only if so, it'll modify the DOM. So you could have multiple render calls, but if nothing is modified between those render calls, nothing will touch the DOM, the real DOM. And by the way our widgets are set up, the render call, you will not need to call it. It's automatically set up to be called for you. But there are cases where you might need to invoke render at some point. If, for example, you have an asynchronous, task that returns a result that your widget depends on, and that's where we will use the schedule render method. And this is you may need it based on the way your widget works. And in our demo, for our demo purposes, we'll see this used. So just a quick example of what a render method looks like. I'm just here setting some properties from the widget itself. And you can see I am returning an expression that will produce a div node with these values from my widget. And you can see that a lot of these attributes map to the JavaScript properties of elements. So along the same lines, you would use these properties. And there are a few that are different and not found in the out of the box, the native JavaScript element representation. And for that, we have some resources that you can check out. We'll provide some links for the slides at the end of the presentation, but this is where you can see more details about the widget rendering. So for example, if you have CSS classes, it'll show you a snippet of how to set it up. If you have dynamic styles that you want to apply during your rendering, you can see examples of that. If you need to execute code when your node is created and attached to the DOM, you have access to you have a way to hook into that as well. So this is a really nice resource to check out. And just to reiterate, this is all JavaScript, and you can see I'm using these curly brace notation to use the actual values from the widget instance itself, and it's just JavaScript. So when you are implementing your widget, you'll find that in our widgets, we use a TypeScript feature, experimental feature that's called decorators. And what this means is it's just a way of, it's a feature that allows us to enhance at runtime properties, methods, or a class itself. And one of the main ones that you'll be using is subclass along with declared. And what this will do is these are, you can think of as the glue of when you're creating a class with a JavaScript API. And then you have property. This decorator allows us to define how a property will behave. So if you want it to create an instance, for example, from a plain object, you can use the autocast feature. You can define a property as computed. So if it depends on other properties, you can define it with this decorator as well. You can make properties read-only. So if you try to set it from externally, it'll throw an error. You can alias properties as well. So if you, one use case might be you introduce a new property and it deprecates another one. You can alias it to the deprecated one, and just as a convenience. And a shorthand way of using the alias property, which we use in widgets, is alias of. Then comes renderable, and this is used very often in our widget development. And what it does is it marks a property as renderable, and so whenever it changes, it's going to trigger the widget to render and at some point in the future. So this is all wired up for you, so whenever the properties are modified, the rendering occurs automatically. Then we also have accessible handler, and this is a convenience decorator for any click handlers. So it'll allow us to treat enter and spacebar key presses as clicks. So it'll invoke the methods once they are if they're decorated like so. So kind of an overview: when you are implementing a custom widget, say if you want a really basic widget, you would start off by this boilerplate, and all it's doing is it's using some of the decorators we showed to kind of build this MyWidget class, and it's extending the widget base class, and we're just exporting it. Then after that, I mentioned that there's the render method, right? And this is the only one that you actually need to implement when you're developing your own custom widget. And the render method is similar to what we saw in our previous example. All it needs to do is return some element so it can render. And in this case, it's just going to return a div with widget as the content. And as a side note, this import you will need to have, if you are using JSX notation, it's required, just a good thing to keep in mind. Then afterwards, as you add more properties that will affect your UI, you can define these properties using the decorators I showed before. So for example, we have here a name property with widget as its value, and it's marked as renderable. So whenever this widget is created, it's going to render a div with the name value as the text content, which is widget. And if later on I modify the name property, it's going to re-render with an updated value. So just to recap, we went over how our new widgets are structured in version 4x of the JavaScript API, what this brings. We talked about the base widget class, how it works, and how you can take advantage of its lifecycle methods. And especially, we looked closer at how render works and how you would end up writing your render methods to create your UIs. Now with that, I will hand it off to Matt for some styling.
Thanks, JC. All right, so let's briefly talk about styling. So styling with our widgets, we use Sass. Sass is a CSS preprocessor, which basically means it's like CSS, but it adds functionality on top of it, and then it compiles into CSS. And you can learn more about that here at sassling.com. It says CSS with superpowers, and it talks about how you can use it, and what kind of features it has. So what we get with that is we get things like nesting. We can nest CSS statements, selectors. We get variables, so we can store like colors that we use throughout our app. We get functions, mix-ins, and inheritance. So we get all these cool things by using Sass. So just to recap real quick, we use Sass for our widgets, and basically Sass makes it easier to restyle, organize, and ultimately just write less code. So that's why we use it. But you can use whatever you want. If you don't want to use Sass, we're not forcing anyone to build a widget with it. But if you want to look at our styles, we have it both available in Sass and CSS. Okay, so now let's actually build a widget. What we're going to do is we're going to build a bookmarks widget in the 4X API. And let me kind of show you what that's going to look like when we're finished. So in the top corner here, I have this button, and this is the expand widget. And that's going to open up a list, which is a list of our bookmarks. And so these are the wonders of the world. And if I click on one, it'll go to that bookmarks extent, and it does a little animation while it's doing that. And so it's really simple kind of list example of a widget, and kind of a good tutorial that we're going to build. So in order to build that, we need to know a little bit about where bookmarks come from and how we can use them. So if we go to our web map class and we go under properties, we see that it has a property called bookmarks, and it's an array of objects. And each one of these bookmarks has a name and an extent associated with it. So basically it can say, what the title of the bookmark is and the extent for that bookmark to go to. So if we want to create a bookmark widget, we have to come up with a simple design for the API. So this is what we came up with. We have our VIEWMODEL interface, and this is going to have a property called bookmark items, and it will be a collection of a accessor class we created called bookmark item. So this will house all the bookmark items. We're going to have a property called state, and it's either going to be in a loading state, ready state, or disabled state. And this is going to be a computed property that will be set depending on what state the view model is in. We also have the view property. This is what the user will supply, and we'll be able to get the bookmarks from the map associated on the view. And then we'll have a method called goTo, which will be required to pass a bookmark item, and it'll return a promise. So basically this method will go to the bookmark item's extent, and it returns a promise so you can know once that is completed. And so here's a little helper class we're creating called bookmark item. You can see it has the basic bookmark stuff like extent and name, but we wanted to enhance it a little bit more and add a property called active. And we'll be setting this to true when the bookmark is actually being navigated to. So this way in our widget, we can show an animation spinner when the bookmark item is active. So in order to do this, we have a list of steps. I'm going to walk through setting up the HTML and constructing the view model. After we do that, I'll turn it over to JC, and he's going to walk through the view and the styling. But first, we have this simple page, which is just like the one we saw before, but no button or anything. And I'll show the code for this. So in the repository that we'll share it at the end, we have a demos folder, and it has the completed demo, and it also has a starting point. And this has an index page that's really basic. It's basically just loading a web map and a map view and starting those up. So it's basically just a web map. And then we have our app folder, which has our empty widget view. We have a bookmarks folder inside that. This is where our view model is going to be. And here's that bookmark item helper class I mentioned. It's pretty simple class. It's just extending accessor. So it's you can see I'm creating this class, bookmark item, extends accessor. It has the properties I need, the active one, the extent, which is type of extent, and the name, which is just a string, which will just be the name of the bookmark. So that's already set up for us. Let's go and actually build this thing. So if I go to the HTML steps, first thing I'm going to want to do is link the style sheet in my page. So if I go to the index page, I go up here to the top, I'm just going to put in a link to where my bookmarks style sheet is going to be. And right now this file is just empty. Next thing I want to do is important. Set up the Dojo package. I'll kind of explain that. This you want to go before you load the JavaScript API. And the reason I'm configuring the Dojo package, or setting up the Dojo config with the package, is to let Dojo know where it can find my custom package. So this is how Dojo is going to know where to find and load my widget. So I've created a package called demo, and it's going to be in this location under the app folder. And so when I load the widget later, it'll know exactly where to find it. So that's what we want to do next. We want to actually load the expand widget and the bookmarks widget. So I'll go down into where I'm requiring the map view. Under there, I'm going to load the expand widget and the bookmarks. And then I'm going to assign them right here. Okay, cool. So now I'm requiring those modules. I can use them. Next, what I want to do is initialize the bookmarks widget. So under my view, I'm going to initialize the bookmarks widget. There we go, formatting. And I'm just going to pass it the view because that's what it needs to be able to grab the bookmarks from the views map. And then I'm going to start up the expand widget. So here's the expand widget, and it's just going to be assigned the view. And then the content of the expand widget is going to be the bookmarks widget, which is right here. And then I'm going to add this expand widget in the top right of the views user interface. So that's it'll be in the top right, like that button we saw earlier. So that's it for the view steps. But it's not going to show anything useful yet because we actually haven't created the widget. So it's going to say, you know, bookmarks is not there. But we have it ready once we get the view ready. All right, so next steps, we're going to build the view model. And so the first thing we need is a really basic structure of an accessor class. So if I go into the bookmarks view model, I have a basic accessor class set up. I have my TypeScript dependencies. I'm importing a few decorators from accessor support. I'm importing accessor. And then my class is just extending accessor. And I'm calling it bookmarks view model. Okay, cool. So now I need to import some of the modules I'm going to use in this class. We talked about how we're going to use an Esri core collection, which will be a collection of bookmark items. And so I'm importing the bookmark item class, and I'm importing collection. And then I'm creating a constant called bookmark item collection, so it knows what kind of collection it's going to be. Next thing I want to do is add properties to my class. I'll copy this and I'll walk through them. Okay, so the properties I'm going to have are the bookmark items, and it's going to be a type of this bookmark item collection. And then I'll just initialize it to an empty collection. Then I have the state, and this is that computed property that I mentioned. So this property will be read-only, and it's going to depend on the view and when the view is ready. So basically, whenever the view changes, it's going to see if it can get a view, first of all. it's going to see if the view is ready. And then, so if the view is ready, it's going to return a string of ready. If the view is not ready, but it has a view, it's going to return a string of loading. And if it doesn't have a view at all, it's going to return a string of disabled. So those are properties. Oh, and I forgot to mention the view. This is what the user is going to pass in. Kind of important because this is what the bookmarks are going to be populated from. So it's going to get the map from the view and then get the bookmarks from the map. So there's a couple problems here. You can see we're missing, we need to define what state is and what map view is. So that's next. We're going to create a type called state. Put this up here. So as I mentioned before, state can either be ready, loading, or disabled. And so now state is not complaining anymore. And then I want to import map view. So it knows what this map view type is. Okay, cool. So no more problems there. Can continue. The next thing I'm going to do is import a couple utilities that we're going to use. The first one is handle registry. And this is a utility that lets us manage handles and listeners. So what we'll do is we'll create a variable on our class to group and store handles, and this way we can easily remove them in a group or add them to a group. And we're also importing watch utils, which will allow us to easily watch properties of an accessor. So let's create our variable I just mentioned for the handle registry. So I have a private variable called handles, and it's a type of handle registry, and I'm just creating a new handle registry to that. The next thing I'm going to do is set up our lifecycle. So up at the top here in our class, let's add this lifecycle. So when this view model is initialized, I'm going to add a handle, and this handle is going to use watch utils, and it's going to watch the view property on this class. So anytime the view is added, removed, or changed, it's going to call this private method view updated and pass that view. And we'll create this in a minute. I've also created a destroy lifecycle method to clean up anything that my widget does. So when this widget or when this view model is destroyed, it's going to destroy the handles, it's going to set the view to null, and it's going to remove any bookmark items that are there. So just a bunch of cleanup right there. Save that. So now let's create that private method I mentioned called view updated. So I'm going to go down below my properties, add this private method section. And so when the view is updated, it's going to pass the view, and it's going to get the reference to the handles property or private variable. And we're going to create a key called map. And so this will be for all our map handles. We're going to remove any existing map handles we have. And then if we don't have a view, we're just going to stop there. But if we do have a view, we're going to wait for that view to be loaded. And once that's loaded, we're going to watch that view for its map property and kind of do the same thing. So if this view has a map that's added at a later time or changed or removed, we'll call this map updated private method. So that's what we need to add next. And this is just because they're kind of nested, like the view has a map, so we need to kind of watch both. So here's the map updated one. I'm passing it a map. If we don't have a map, we're just going to stop there. But if we do have a map, we're going to look at that map and get its bookmarks. And then the bookmark items on this widget, we're going to remove all of them, if any exist. And then we're going to add all the bookmarks we got from the map. Okay, so you may have noticed that it's complaining about map here. It doesn't know what that is. So go back to the top. Let's import the map class. Okay, no longer complaining. That's good. So now we have all of our properties and methods defined. or private methods. What we need to do now is add our public method, and this is going to be that go-to method that takes us to a bookmark. So I'm going to create another section here under properties, and this is going to be called public methods, and our public method is going to be called go-to, and it's going to take a bookmark item as an argument, and it's going to return a promise. And so if we don't have a bookmark item, we're going to return immediately with a rejected promise. And if we don't have a view, we're going to return immediately with a rejected promise as well. But if we do have a view and a bookmark item, we're going to set that bookmark item to active. And then we're going to go to that bookmark item's extent on the view. And then after that is done, we're going to set the bookmark item's active property to false. And if there's some kind of error, it's going to set to false as well. So this is going to be our method to go to a bookmark. And you'll see that it doesn't know about this promise utility. So we need to import that now. And just up again at the top here, it's going to import that. Cool. So not complaining about anything. It's good. What we can do now is kind of test this, see if it compiles. What I'm going to do is just go into my terminal here. I'm going to go type compile, TSE, and now it's going to build it. So that's good. It means that everything compiled correctly. But since this isn't a widget, we can't really visually test it. So what we're going to do is we're going to test the view model itself and make sure that it looks like it should. So I'm going to go into my index page again. And instead of importing the bookmarks, I'm going to import the bookmarks view model. And then what I want to do is comment out the expand widget because we're not going to need that now because it's not a widget. It's going to just be a view model. And lastly, I'm going to add a global variable and kind of log out that global variable. So this bookmarks isn't actually bookmarks, it's the bookmarks view model. I'm going to call bookmarks view model right here and log that out. So if I go here and go to my console, reload this, if I can make that a little easier to read. So I get a log of the view model. I can see that it has a state's ready. It has the view that we're passing to it. It has a collection of bookmark items with 7 items. And I can look at each one of those items and see that it's an accessor, and it has an active property, an extent, and it has a name. So cool, everything looks good there. The next thing I want to do is just kind of test the go-to method. So if I go back to my steps here, I'm going to paste this in the console. And what this is going to do is it's going to get the first bookmark of the bookmarks view model. So this is a collection. We're going to get the first item. And then on the view model, we're going to call go-to with that first bookmark. So let's copy that, go back into the console, clear this out. And then boom, so I can see that the method is working. And so our view model is complete. We're ready to start looking into the view now. So those are the steps for the HTML and the view model. I'm going to now turn it back over to JC Franco, and he's going to take over the view.
Thanks, Matt. Okay, so let's continue from that test page that Matt showed you before. And I just want to call out that I'm creating a bookmarks widget here instead of the view model. And I'm placing it inside of an expand that's going to be placed on the top right corner of our UI. And if I reload the page, we're going to get an error because, as Matt showed you before, we haven't actually created our widget, but let's take care of that now. So I just want to mention beforehand that I've configured my IDE to compile the TypeScript and SAS automatically. So just to make it simpler to see our progress. So let's start off by copying over that boilerplate we showed in the slides to kind of get our widget started. And well, first we were getting a error about the bookmarks not being a constructor, and it's because we didn't have any file actually to instantiate. So after bringing our bookmarks, the boilerplate to create our bookmarks, we are defining our bookmarks widget, and it's extending the widget base class, and we're exporting this module. So now when I reload, you shall see a different error, and this is related to the rendering, because if you remember, we need to implement the render method. So let's take care of that. But before we do that, I am going to go ahead and bring in all the imports that will be required by this widget, just to kind of make it simpler to walk through. So I'll just briefly talk about what I'm importing. So a lot of these Matt showed in his code, but I am importing some utilities to watch for properties. I bring some imports for decorators to build our accessor class. I'm also bringing handle registry to take care of our handles. For building our widget, I'm bringing the widget base class along with some other decorators. And I'm also importing the view model and the bookmark item that Matt built before. And I'm also bringing in map view for a property that we'll be aliasing just for the type. And lastly, I'll be using Dojo's IE9 module to kind of help with localization, which we'll show at the end. And that's it for imports, but I do want to show this kind of pattern that we use in our widget development. And this is an object that we have in all of our widgets, and it's more of a lookup for all of our CSS classes. And it's really a convenience to kind of keep all of the classes that are being used by a widget in a single place. So after that, that's it for all the imports and constants that we'll be using. So let's just implement a very simple render method. And what it'll do is it'll return a div element, and it's just setting the base CSS class, which is demo bookmarks in this case. So now if I refresh the page, we'll see the bookmark inside of the expand widget, but you notice there's nothing inside. But if I inspect the DOM, you see that we are creating our demo bookmarks element, which we define in a render method. So this is a very simple render method, and it's not showing anything, but let's continue and change that. So from the view model steps, you saw that the view model is providing bookmark items, right? So let's go ahead and create some methods to render the actual bookmark items. So I have some rendering methods for individual bookmarks. And what these methods are doing is the render bookmarks is just getting the bookmark items from the view model. And then for each one of these items, it's going to render the bookmark item. It's going to return a node that represents a bookmark item. And what that bookmark item rendering looks like is we'll take a look at the render bookmark method here to see what's going on, but it's just grabbing the active and name properties from the bookmark item itself, and it's creating this object to toggle classes on or off. And then we're just creating a list item, assigning a bookmark item as a data attribute for this element, setting some classes, and the content of this list item is going to be the name of the bookmark itself, which is right here. So I'm getting some errors because the view model, we haven't really defined that property yet. So let's do that right now. So after doing this, what we are doing here is defining a view model property that its type is going to be a bookmarks view model. We're just creating one by default. If you pass an empty object, it's going to use the auto casting feature and create a bookmarks view model automatically by using the type property here. And I'm also making this property renderable. So whenever view model changes or its state property changes, it's going to cause my widget to re-render. And lastly, I'm also setting up a view property on the widget itself, and it's really an alias of the ViewModel view property that Matt showed before. And we do this because to allow this pattern, so if I look at the index page again, we pass a view directly to the bookmarks widget, and internally what it's doing is it's passing that view to the view model itself. So it's a convenience way of proxying properties. So let's use this render bookmarks method in our render method. So let's update it. So now in my render method, what I'm doing is I'm creating the nodes for the bookmarks, and I'm also getting the view model state. So now I'm checking to see if the state is ready and if I actually have bookmarks. If so, I'm going to create a list with the bookmark nodes themselves. Otherwise, I'm not going to create anything, and this will be the content of my widget now. So now if I refresh and check the bookmarks widget, you see we get all of our bookmark items rendered. But notice that I'm clicking the items, but nothing's happening. So, and this is because we haven't actually configured them to be interactive. So let's take care of that. So the only thing that I'll do, let's update since we want the bookmark items to be interactive, let's go to the render bookmarks method, and I'll just be copying over, I'll show you what I changed, but I am just making sure that whenever this element is clicked, or if a key down is pressed and the key is an enter or spacebar, it's going to actually invoke the go to bookmark method. And I'll copy it over. And what this go to bookmark method does is it's just going to grab the associated bookmark item from the element, and it's going to call the ViewModel's go to method. And the way this works in terms of key presses is by using the accessible handler decorator we talked about earlier. So this will make sure to filter out any keys that are not enter or space. So now if I refresh and click on any of the bookmark items, it's going to actually go to the bookmark. And this is because now when I click on it, it's going to invoke that go to bookmark method. So one thing that I want to show is okay, so notice the loading status here is stuck, and it's because we apply the class to show the loading indicator when we create the item, but we're not updating it when the bookmark item's active property is changing. So whenever that happens, our widget is not rendering. So we need to tell our widget to re-render whenever that happens. So let's wire up the widget to do that. And we'll do that by copying over some methods and take advantage of the life cycle. So let me copy also a few things. So what I'm doing now here is whenever my widget initializes, it's now going to watch for the bookmark items themselves. Whenever they change, it's going to call this method that I'm going to copy over. And it's invoked whenever the bookmark items themselves change. And once I do that. So whenever the bookmark items change, I'm just going to clear the previous ones that I was watching, the previous handles I was watching, and then for each of the bookmark items, I'm going to watch for its active and name properties. And whenever these change, I'm going to tell my widget to render whenever it can. And then afterwards, I'm just gonna keep track of the handles for these watchers. So going back to the lifecycle, one thing that I am using is the handle registry. And I'm also using the destroy lifecycle hook to kind of clean up when my widget gets destroyed. So now if I reload and click around, I should no longer see that loading indicator get stuck. Because now whenever it is no longer active, the bookmark item is no longer active, it's going to render appropriately. So just as a final fine tuning, I'm just going to add a loader, because if I refresh and open quickly, you see that there's an empty state and then the bookmark items just pop in. So I'll just create a loader very quickly. And what I'm doing here is I'm just creating a loading node, and it's using some CSS to set up a loading icon and rotate it. And the only difference here is now if the state is either not ready or if I don't have any bookmarks, but the ViewModel state is loading, I'm going to use that, show that loading node. So now if I refresh and open, you'll see that loading indicator show up. And lastly, I'm going to improve the accessibility of the widget by adding some ARIA roles, and this will let screen readers know that what these different elements, what they are, kind of help them better interpret what their purpose is. And for our lists, we're just going to label them with a label, localized label. And for our bookmark items, I'm going to set a role of button because they are interactive, and also a tooltip for when you hover over them, as well as an ARIA label for screen readers. So now if I refresh and hover over, you get that little tooltip, and screen readers would better express what these bookmark items do. So that's it for the view itself. Let's take a look at the styling, and I kind of cheated and compiled the styles beforehand so we can actually see in our demo steps. But what I'll do in terms of SAS, I'll just walk through the entire SAS and just kind of highlight some of the neat features that we can use when we bring SAS to the table. And up front, I just want to bring up that we can use variables. So we can define variables up front and then just reuse like wherever they're needed. Another neat thing that allows us to kind of keep our styles more concise, or at least make it more obvious how different selectors relate to each other, is by using nesting. So you can see that I have my demo bookmarks as a parent, and then inside I have these child selectors. And these also are using a syntax that allows me to reuse the parent's selector name. So for example, this selector is the same as this one over here. And it's just using that shorter syntax to kind of make it more concise. Another neat thing that we can use is functions. So out of the box, we have some functions. For example, here we have a function to handle color. And it's just allowing me to kind of easily be able to change the color dynamically, not having to actually think about the values. And what this does is it allows me to quickly just change one variable, and if I refresh, you'll see a different color scheme. It's all dynamically done just by changing that one variable. So that's it for styling and the view. And with that, I'll hand it back to Matt.
Thanks, Franco. All right, so we're just going to quickly recap. So just to recap, widgets are single functionality user interface components. We use them so we can reuse them throughout the application or different applications. We talked about our widget framework and how that's used and all the things it lets you do. And then we went through constructing a widget and how things are separated between view models and views and what those two different things do. And then we briefly touched on styling and how we use SAS. So just some more resources we have here. We'll share out a link to these at the end, so I'm not going to go through all of them, but our JavaScript docs have help topics on setting up TypeScript, implementing Accessor, a whole widget development section, and things on styling and patterns. Also talks about how you can use TypeScript and Sass. And with that, thank you guys for attending. Here is the source code, and I'll turn it over to Amy for any questions.
Thank you, Matt. We are now going to begin answering the questions submitted during today's presentation. We've received quite a few, so we probably won't be able to get to all of them, but we will address the ones that we're not able to get to in a GeoNet blog post after this webinar. As a reminder, you can still submit questions through the questions pane in the attendee control panel. So we'll start with the first one. Which IDE was Matt using during today's demo?
Thanks, Amy. I'm using Visual Studio Code, and I have a bunch of little plugins and stuff installed. I can maybe post some of this on GeoNet at some later point, but yeah, I'm using Visual Studio Code.
Okay, wonderful. Does Esri provide Visual Studio project templates for creating widgets?
I'm going to defer to JC on that one. I don't think so, but JC, do you know?
Not right now, but I don't see why we couldn't. I know there's a project going on to make it easy to set up the boilerplate for building widgets. But yeah, we could work on providing that out of the box. I mean, I use IntelliJ, and I have some templates that we can maybe convert, assuming they're similar.
All right, can we create a 4x widget without using TypeScript?
So to use our widget framework, you need to use TypeScript. But as we mentioned, we have view models. And so if you want to, you could just use the view model and then recreate the widget using whatever framework or whatever you want, basically. But to use our widget framework, yeah, you do need TypeScript.
Wonderful. Is it possible to incorporate other libraries such as YUI, jQuery, Moo, Scriptaculous, Blockly, Tidy, PureVMC, Script Core, etc.?
So kind of the same thing. Yes, you can use these with our widget framework, but you can also, just use those if you wanted to by just using the view models. So they will work and play together. You'll have to do a couple little things with the widget framework, but they will play nice. JC, did you want to add anything onto that?
No, I mean, if those UI libraries, depending on what they do, they might. I mean, they technically can work together. It's just of how you structure them that may end up being tricky or not.
Yep.
The demo uses the web map modules with a portal item. Can I build a widget without using portal? Say, if I'm using JS API code to build my map by loading my own layers.
Yes, of course. We just used a portal item because it would be less code for us to write. And we didn't want to deter from the actual widget part and show you code for setting up map layers and stuff like that. But you could definitely use just maps and layers and stuff.
Okay, and for our last question, is there a way to get a reference to an existing map instance during runtime? I'd like to create a bookmarklet which can load a custom widget on a web page containing an ArcGIS JavaScript API-based map.
JC, do you know about that one?
So I'm assuming, I mean, if you have a reference to a map external to the widget, it just goes back to the way you design your APIs. So if it's a property that you just pass along to the widget itself, I think you could do it that way. So that's one thing you could do.
All right, thank you, Matt and JC, and thank you everyone for attending today's webinar, Building a Widget Using the ArcGIS API for JavaScript. On behalf of Esri and our presenters, thank you for joining us today and have a great rest of your day.